So it's been 4 months since protests over Jacob Zuma's imprisonment led to wide-scale looting and deliberate sabotage in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. The quarterly crime stats from July to September released today are another reminder of just how devastating that period was. The murder rate in July and for that period, 20% higher than the previous period, attributed largely to the violence that occurred in July. But months on, do we know what caused it, who orchestrated it, and why? Well, I'm joined now by Qaanitah Hunter, journalist and co-author of 8 Days in July. Along with eyewitness accounts from Kaveel Singh and Wicks, Qaanitah has detailed what happened during those 8 days that cost our country 342 lives, billions of rands in looted goods and damaged infrastructure, and untold damage to our reputation as a nation. Qaanitah, thank you so much for coming through to studio. I've read your book and it's brought it all back. The absolute horror of what we went through when we actually thought that our country was on the brink of potentially all-out war. Have we as a country actually properly processed what happened?
I don't think so, Sally, and I think that we as a nation suffer from amnesia as we go from crisis to crisis or scandal to scandal. And what happens is, I suppose it's our survival mechanism, coping mechanism, that we just sort of move along. But if we have to take a moment to actually understand what happened in July, that was unprecedented. It was literally the country, seeing that level of violence it has not seen in 27 years. And I think that what was important for us in writing this book is to say, what happened? Let's start there. What actually happened? Why did it happen? And then how was it allowed to happen before we can get to the point of who should be held accountable?
The subtitle of the book is Inside the Zuma Unrest that set South Africa alight. Do you see Jacob Zuma as at the heart of all of it, essentially, or merely the catalyst for something that spiraled quickly out of control?
So I think that it's a bit of both. So at the center of it is Jacob Zuma, and you cannot look at what happened in July without talking or focusing on former President Jacob Zuma and his incarceration, and then the actions of his supporters. But what you also saw was the meshing together of this factional sort of motive by former President Jacob Zuma and his supporters, and then organized crime. And then what we saw play out in the streets of South Africa was the combination, the combustion of that, as well as the weaponization of the socioeconomic crisis that persists in South Africa every day, whether it was unemployment, poverty, inequality. South Africa was lit for a very distinct purpose, and that purpose obviously was to create ultimate confusion, mayhem, bedlam, to prove a political point, essentially. And so you can't separate one from the other.
Do you think the upshot of it is that essentially Zuma has proved that he's actually untouchable? We know that he got that medical parole granted by Fraser against the recommendations of the parole board, but also we are not seeing his family members or anyone close to him really answering for what happened on social media, family members endorsing and praising a lot of what was happening. And the fact that so much mayhem was created, do you think that essentially he is actually untouchable?
And I think this has to do with the ANC, right? And their ability to stomach a lot of this and to allow their internal shenanigans to spill over into the streets at the cost of lives, at the cost of 50 billion rand of our economy. The reality of it is former President Jacob Zuma and his supporters presided over the continuation of unemployment, poverty and inequality, and then when they needed to use it, they weaponized it for their own nefarious gains to almost create an organic uprising of sorts, obviously, as we know later, against the sitting president. Again, it was something quite unique. You don't really see revolt from within a political party have this much consequence on people's lives. But that's what happened. And you see now the tardiness in holding people account. Again, the country is being held ransom by the governing party.
I want to move on to the intelligence reports, which you go into in some detail in the book. And it's really interesting because we know at the time. In fact, it was just afterwards. There was quite a spat about the intelligence reports, a spat between the State Security Minister at the time and the Police Minister, Becky Cele, about whether those intelligence reports were handed over. And from what you've written, it seems there was great concern about the potential for violence that weekend before he went to prison around Nkandla, and the night he was taken to prison. And then it seems there was a big sigh of relief when he was peacefully apprehended and taken to prison. If you've looked through all those intelligence reports, what picture are they painting? Are you getting a picture of deliberately ignoring the intelligence reports, not enough emphasis on just how bad things would be, or relaxing too quickly?
Yeah, so a myriad of all of that. The first is we know now for certain that intelligence was provided 2 months before, in May, that this was going to happen. So that's what we didn't know, and now we know from this book. The second thing is the intelligence reports, paint the picture of what was happening. But I could have watched your show and have written similar reports. So the quality of the intelligence reports is something that has to be in question, to say how much of it was not what we came too late. And then the operationalizing of those reports by Nat Jones. And that was an important focus in our book, and a distinction to make, that intelligence reports are meaningless. It's what the state security cluster, the security cluster and the state security apparatus do with that information. And so what you saw was all of these warnings about all of this unrest and possible violence, treasonous actions, if you like, attacks on the JSC, attacks on the Durban port, and the recommendations were intensified roadblocks. I mean, that sort of, one questions, how do you have such a big disparity between the information about what may happen versus the response? And then, on top of it, you saw the undermining or the complete failure by the police. So the question that we asked was why? And the answer is just not sort of one thing, this person failed in his job. It's a culmination of things. It's a culmination of them being outsmarted because, people on the inside knew that police had been completely activated the week before, and therefore they would be understaffed. It is the constant underfunding of the police and law enforcement in general. And so what we try to do in this book is not to not give you easy answers, to go into the heart of how does the security cluster operate and how those failures contributed in what we saw in July.
Which leads me to the obvious question, could this happen again?
And that's the scary part of all of this, is that at the time President Cyril Ramaphosa warned that if there's not fundamental change, or South Africa, what this proved was that South Africa could be ignited again. And the scary part is that what July proved is that it could be ignited for any nefarious intention. And the reality of it is not much has changed since then. We've not seen any real consequences for people in the police who failed in their duty. We're not seeing real political consequences at all. Probably maybe the election results were seen as a consequence in KwaZulu-Natal, but I mean, that's a far stretch. And more importantly, there have not been measures been put in place to have so that the security cluster is strengthened. One last thing, Sally, is that you've also not seen punishments. Justice has not been seen to be done. So justice has to be done and seen to be done as well. The National Director of Public Prosecutions, Shamila Batoyi, told Parliament that this could happen again if there isn't, serious prosecutions. But what you're seeing is sort of mid-tier people being, loudmouths on social media being arrested, and no one really at the center of this unrest being nabbed.
Why do you think not? Why have those people not been brought to book? Is it because of the dysfunction within the ANC that it essentially mobilizes them, as you mentioned earlier?
Yes. Absolutely. And I think that spills over in the dysfunction in the security cluster. That was we must not forget that the hollowing out of the NPA, the hollowing out of the criminal justice system was done on purpose and done very systematically over the years of former President Jacob Zuma. And so it is inevitable now that when such things happen, it takes place with so much impunity, because they know what they have done to hollow out our criminal justice system, and rebuilding it has been at a snail's pace. And I think the important part now is that we have to have consequences in the form of the South African Human Rights Commission Commission investigation. We need a report that the President commissioned from Professor Sandy Africa and her colleagues about the role of the security cluster in this unrest. And then you need to see real prosecutions and sentences.
Has the civil unrest stopped, or has it just gone underground? And the reason I ask you that is because we've seen the cyber attack on the port of Durban. We also saw the cyber attack on the Department of Justice. And just today, Eskom saying we have clear proof now of sabotage of the electricity network. And they showed quite clearly how bolts had been sawn through. This was no accident. Do you think that there are still elements at play trying to destabilize our country? Absolutely,
and there will continuously be. What July did was highlight the extent of the inefficiency of the state and the weakness of the state. And what worries me now is that for those with nefarious agendas, like those operating around and within Eskom, know how weak the state is and know how easy it is to get away with much. And so, as a result, what you're going to see, if not copycat, I mean, just the irony of this book is that we go into detail. We talk about one criminal mafia-esque syndicate, if you like, the truckers that sort of ignited a lot of the unrest on the N3 with burning of the trucks, and we detail that, the genesis of all of that. Only for the day this book was launched, they were doing the exact same thing on the N3 highway. And so you see cause and effect. You see the weakening of the criminal justice system, and then you see criminality just continuing with no consequences. Again, like I said, Sally, this was the perfect storm of bad politics and organized crime, and it just spilled over, and ordinary lives were affected. You mentioned we're still waiting for that report from Sandy Africa, and while the Phoenix killings are being probed and there's a court case underway, there are over 300 people, and we haven't heard anything about inquests or arrests or murder dockets being opened. Do you think that we're ever going to get to the bottom of the violence and the killings and see true accountability? We absolutely hope for that, but I think that all indication shows that we may not get that, and that's why this book is important, Sally, so that people can actually understand the gravity of what happened, because we forget. And what this book seeks to do is give you a picture, a 360 picture. This was happening on the streets. This was happening in the security cluster. This was happening in terms of politics. So you understand that these are people's lives. Everyone was affected by this in some way, and we need to have people demanding accountability, demanding consequences. But how can that happen if we sort of just move on to the next thing? And again, you can't blame South Africans. Things happen at such a rapid rate. So much happens all the time. And so it's important for us to take one step back and say, why has there not been serious consequences of it? Why has there not been any heads that rolled? What is the reason that we don't have any police accountability? Just taking police into account. Let's forget the State Security Agency. Let's forget everything else. And the important thing now is, if you reflect on the consequences of July, you see it in the crime stats that were released today. You saw it in the budget of Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana, where money that could have been used to uplift people's lives are now being used to repair the country from the damages of July. Yeah. And your book is extraordinary. Congratulations to all three of you. And it is also a document that will put it on record so that we don't forget. So thank you so much for chatting to me about it this evening. Really do appreciate your time. That, of course, is Qaanitah Hunter, journalist and co-author of 8 Days in July, a detailed account of the civil unrest that cost over 300 lives and billions of rand in looted property and damaged infrastructure.